In the last part, you added a data model to your project. The reminders data model file is where you're going to do most of the initial work to get the object graph set up. Navigate to reminders.xc data model D if you aren't already in there. Right now, you should see just an empty file. On the left, you should see a navigation menu of sorts where you can select the different entities, fetch requests, or configurations you've created. Don't worry if you don't know what any of that means, you will soon enough. In the middle, there is an editor area where you can set up the entities or any other objects that you create. And finally, on the right is the assistant editor where you can customize properties. Since you're building a reminders app, you need to model a reminder, and you'll start by creating an entity. At the bottom of the editor window, you should see a row of buttons. The second from the left says Add Entity. Go ahead and click it to add a new entity to your data model. When this entity is created, it is given a generic name, Entity. Select it from the list, and in the Data Model Inspector, that's the very last icon in the inspector area, change the name to Reminder. In addition to changing the name, there are several ways to customize your entity. Right below the name text field in the editor, you can see a checkbox. You would select this abstract entity checkbox if you don't want to create any instances of this entity. In many programming languages, there exists the concept of an abstract class, which is more or less a class that must be subclassed with specific implementation details before it can be used. An abstract entity is very similar. It serves as a blueprint for a child entity that you can then define, and the child entity is the one that's instantiated instead. Next, you can specify whether the entity has a parent. The parent entity field goes hand in hand with this abstract entity option. If you defined a vehicle entity as an abstract entity, you can then define a car and a truck entity, each of which reference the vehicle entity as its parent. Just like subclassing, the car and truck entity would inherit the properties of its parent, and this allows you to organize your manage objects and keep the model layer nice and clean. You're going to ignore the rest of the options here for now. We'll come back to some, but others are a bit too complicated for the simple app you're building, and you'll ignore those altogether. Okay, so you have a basic entity, but now you need to customize it. Much like you would add stored properties to types, you can add and configure attributes on your entities. An attribute describes a property of an entity, and when creating one, you need to define 4 things at minimum: the name of the attribute, the type of the underlying data, whether the attribute should be saved in the data store, and whether you're required to supply a value when the attribute is saved. Since this entity represents a reminder, you need to add attributes typically associated with a reminder. So first up is the title. You can either hit the plus button here at the bottom of the attributes section, or you can click on the Add Attribute button in the bottom row on the right. You'll start by giving this attribute the name title. Next, you need to define the type of data. If you tap on the undefined value that's there by default, you should see a drop-down that lists all the types you can store using core data. Nearly all of these are pretty self-explanatory, except for ones like transformable and binary data, but you'll ignore those for now. Let's set the title property to be of type string. Cool, so you now have an attribute name and a type. With the attributes selected, let's move over to the Data Model Inspector. Here, you'll find a lot more that you can customize for each attribute. So the name and title, the title that we give as the name, and the type is already listed here. As discussed earlier, you need to specify whether this property needs to have a value when saved, and this rule is defined by this optional checkbox. Optional attributes are not required to have a value when saved to the persistent store, and as you can see, attributes are marked optional by default. Now, it's important to note that a core data optional is not the same as a Swift optional. When you generate code to work with entities, something you will do later, you may notice that properties are sometimes generated as optional even if you uncheck this box in the model editor. And that's because a Swift optional can be used to represent a required attribute purely as a means of flexibility. Now, there may be times when, let's say, you initialize a reminder at one point in your app, and then you assign a required value later at some point after initialization. Representing that required property in code using an optional allows you to do this, to provide a value after initialization. You're going to uncheck the optional property here because all reminders need a title. Next is the transient configuration. A transient attribute is not saved to the persistent store. Now you might be thinking, what's even the point? Well, all attributes are saved to the store by default unless you check this box right here and mark it as transient. You would use a transient attribute if you wanted a useful place to temporarily store a calculated or a derived value. Think of it sort of like Swift's computed properties. You can use them to enhance the user experience or your logic in a certain way, but again, that value doesn't need to be saved. If you mark a property as transient, it will be defined in the object's generated interface, but core data will not keep track of it for you to a large degree. We'll explore transient properties later on. Now, right below that, you have the derived attribute. You would mark an attribute as derived if you want to optimize fetch performance when retrieving values from the persistent store. Notice that when I checked that box earlier, and you can do it again, the model inspector changes. So we're going to uncheck it again, and we'll skip this property for now. Optimizing fetches is not something you're going to worry about with such a simple app. Next up is the option to give your attribute a default value, in this case a string value. Giving reminders a default title wouldn't make sense, so we'll leave this unchecked for now, but this can come in handy quite often. Just like that, your reminder has a title attribute. This is a good start, but it's not enough to model all the information you need. In the next video, let's flesh out the reminder entity.